So welcome again, all of you. This is our seventh session. And as you might have noticed that the last four sessions as we have planned them don't really fall into my area of expertise, but they are kind of part of my general understanding of these concepts as I taught these courses and planned them. We have resources for all these courses that Dr. Jenny Canine had prepared, which I will pass on the link to you. And if I upload this video, the link would also be in the description. And there are quite a few resources that she had gathered, which you can use in designing and planning your course. So today's topic is how to teach a literary analysis course. Now, in most American universities, lit analysis or literary analysis is offered primarily for English majors. So there are two analysis kind of courses that they take. They take literature analysis, which is an earlier course in their careers, and then they go on to take the literary theory course. Both are required courses for English majors. Now the difference is that the literary theory course is taught at a higher level of abstraction, and it mostly teaches them various schools of literary theory, what are some example texts of it, and then they read essays and articles about various approaches to literary criticism. The literary analysis course is mostly about the mechanics of literary works and how to read them. So when you design a course, you have to keep in mind that it is going to be on a lower level of abstraction in terms of theory. It has to have more practical advice, and it is for students of English literature and literary studies in the earlier stages of their training. Now, a typical literary analysis course will obviously have a textbook, and you can research them. The syllabus that I'm going to share for you already has some textbooks that it uses, and these textbooks are going to introduce to the students what to look for in any given literary work. There are also specific books. One of the books that Dr. Canine often used it's called How to Read a Poem, and that technically just explains to you various aspects of poetry and how to read and interpret poems. A literary analysis course is also sometimes called literary analysis and interpretation, which presupposes that we'll be giving our students some technical knowledge about how various genres are put together, what kind of different poems are there. If you're teaching poems, what is meter, what kind of, rhyme schemes are used, what kind of a meter is used. And then that becomes part of their repertoire. As they read a poem, they have to figure out whether it's an iambic pentameter, and if it is that, why does it matter to know that? So there is more technical detail. And then similarly, if we are teaching a play, we will teach them, how a Shakespearean play is put together, why there are 5 acts, why there used to be 3 acts, and then how to cite a play or a poem. The system of citation will be part of the course on literary analysis. And then if we go to the novelistic form or the short story form, part of the reading process will then involve the structure of a short story, right? So technically, we just teach them the vocabularies of analysis and then how different genres of literature are put together. In terms of fiction, there are certain topics under which we try to train our students. So if we look at the constitutive parts of a short story, we also in this course will teach them, first of all, what is the plot, right? What is the setting? What is and what to do with the tone? What's the significance of characters? What kind of different characters are there? And the theme. So the reason you do that is because depending on what you emphasize, let's say if you're writing about the novel, there is no way you can cover everything about the novel. So your essay could be, hope is the theme of this novel, and in this essay I'll try to prove how that becomes a theme. So let's go with the plot, right? What is the plot? The plot of a novel is what happens from point A to point B within that story. Okay, that simply is the plot. That's why we sometimes called novels as plot-driven novels. Plot-driven novels are where you have to follow the story sequentially to really get it, and it's the plot that is important. Now, how is the plot complicated? If you implot the plot line, there are two techniques that authors use to complicate a plot, right? There are flashbacks. So flashbacks add past knowledge into the line of the plot, right? And there is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing adds to what is to come, right, in the linear progression of a plot. Now, plots can be sometimes played with. Sometimes you start in the present and go into the past. Sometimes you are in the future and most of the story is told in the past. So you play with temporality, but in any given novel or short story, the plot is the movement from point A to point B of a story. When you come to the setting, now setting has two connotations. One is the place, where is the story set? And second is the temporality, the time period. Which time period is the story set in? So there is a larger setting. The story is set in Pakistan. And then within the novel or the short story, there will be individual settings, a room, right, a garden. And that gives you an idea of how the story, how each scene is set and what's in it and what's its significance. In terms of time too, there is the general time frame in which the story is set. This is a post-war story. This is a story set in 1960s. This is a fantasy novel set in 2090, right? And that setting in terms of time tells us where the story, in what time frame is it located. And then within the story, you will find different temporalities, where we are. Are we in the present, in the past, or in the future? And then we come to the characters, right? Now, characters, there are two general kinds, right? There are your round characters. These are the characters who change over the course of a story. And there are flat characters. These are characters who do not change. They are just supporting characters, or they stay the same. And one analysis of any given novel or a short story would be who is the main character and why, and how do they change over the course of the story. And then there is the point of view, like whose point of view is being offered in the story, right? Is it an omniscient narrator, a narrator who knows everything, right, and is privy to all the knowledge within the story? Is it a semi-omniscient narrator? Do we get their point of view, that they are privy to some characters' thoughts, but not to all, right? Is it a first-person narrator or a third-person narrator? In traditional literary analysis, the first-person narrator is often viewed with a bit of suspicion, because it is someone who's speaking for themselves or telling someone else's story. So let's say in modernist fiction, it is kind of treated with, a sort of suspicion. Do I trust this story narrator or not? That's the question that you're asking yourself. And then if it's a third person narrator, you have to figure out, who they are. Are they a character within the novel, or is it an outside voice, right? Is it the authorial voice, or is it just a voice that is not included as a character in there, but is telling the story? Most of the time, we encourage our students not to conflate the third person narration with the authorial voice, because that can be problematic, because then they can say, oh, this is what Mohsin Hamid is saying in this novel, even though it's a work of fiction. And then tone. Tone is really important. You have to train our students and train ourselves to figure out, whether this is ironic. Is it satire? Is it humor? Because if we miss the tone, we will completely miss the message of a story or miss what actually a story is doing. So figuring out the tone in literary analysis is deeply important. And then we go to also looking at a story in terms of its theme, right? What is it about? Is it a Bildungsroman, right? Is it about freedom? Is it about environment? Is it about justice? So the reason we teach them this breakdown of the plot, characters, tone, point of view, what kind of narration does it have, and the theme, is because these are kind of the constitutive parts of a work of fiction. But also, when they come to the writing of it, this will kind of become their guiding principle, because when they write about a novel or about a short story or even about a poem, if they are dealing with the theme, then it is a thematic analysis of the story. They are mostly talking about, here is this theme and this is how this is supported in the story. If they are going to discuss the plot, then their discussion has to stay on what happens in the progression of the plot, right? They'll be able to focus their writing more. That's the purpose of it. But overall, it gives them the constitutive elements of any given short story or poem. And then you will see how the author has played with the theme, with the tone, right? Now, when we come to the analysis part of it, and as I said, the poetry section has extensive resources which we'll share with you. In analyzing a poem, the first thing you can start with is what genre of poem is it? Is it a sonnet? Is it a sestina? So part of your reading of a poem would be figuring out, what kind of a poem is it? Is it free verse? Is it heroic couplet? Right? By the way, on an aside, in most American creative writing programs, the heroic couplet and like strict rhyme schemes, they are kind of considered passé. They are considered, most poets here do not do that. It's not part of the contemporary scene unless you're being ironic or slightly archaic, unless, you're trying to emulate, Pope and Milton somewhat. And then when you come to, let's say, analysis of a short story, same. You look at a character, you will try to discuss, what happens to a character, how does a character change, and why. Now, most of the time, this analysis in any literary analysis class stays with the text. So that means a lot of close reading is involved. And the references mostly come from that close reading. You can even dwell on the language and how it's employed, especially if it's a poem. What is the figurative language? What is the literal aspect of the language? You will very rarely use literary theory. In fact, we never really taught literary theory when we taught a literary analysis course. Now, most teachers also use online resources for teaching, vocabularies. What is alliteration, right? What is assonance? What is dissonance? The idea isn't to give them a list of here are the terms that you must memorize and reproduce. That will defeat the purpose. The idea is to give them an understanding of it. What is a metaphor? What is a simile, right? These are also the vocabularies that you're teaching in a literary analysis course. And then you give them examples of it. Why is it important to know what a metaphor is? What's the difference between a metaphor and a simile, right? What is a synecdoche, right? These technical vocabularies will be part of a literary analysis course as well. And you can download the list from the web or get it in printed form in any introductory book to literary analysis. But the way to teach it is not give them a slide and ask them to memorize what is a metaphor and reproduce it in a test, but rather, if you're going to create an assignment, you could give them a poem or a short story and say, what is the metaphoric content of this poem or this short story? And furthermore, how does that work? How does that work within the story? Why is it important? What do metaphors do for us? Similarly, the use of metonymy. So to sum up, like what you're giving them is the technical vocabularies of analysis, and then how works of art, especially short stories or poems, how are they put together? What different genres of them are there? And within that, how, let's say, a short story is structured, what are the constitutive parts of it, and then how to analyze a short story from a point of view of a character, from the point of view of maybe authorial voice, from the point of view of the audience, who does it address. All of these things then form part of the training of your students. When I taught the literary analysis course, and I taught it pretty rarely because I usually were assigned to teach the literary theory course. I think one time I did include a little bit of introduction to close reading, not close reading, but new criticism, because it's so deeply connected to close reading. And close reading of text is one of the most important things that you will have to teach in a literary analysis course. And for that, when I taught it, I did use some of the essays, from the main critics of, let's say, new criticism movement, because at the end of the day, what they are also encouraging students to do is to focus on the text. But in a literary analysis class, you can also permit your students to do historical analysis. They can look at a poem and just write about when was it published, what were the historical causes for it in the life of the author. So it's like slight mixture of autobiographical criticism, but not necessarily that dictating the meaning of a poem. So you can give them freedom to do that, with the caveat that, not all poems are biographical and they are not necessarily reflections of a poet's life. Similarly, not all short stories are a reflection of author's politics or author's, rights. The one thing that you're trying to discourage is what we call reflectionism, where we tend to just read anything and believe that it either reflects the time frame where it is set or it reflects the politics of the author. So remember T.S. Eliot's famous term that if we are going to make a correlative with authorial intention, it has to be an objective correlative. It can't be something so bizarre that's happening in the story, which we then relate to the author and their life, right? So it has to be that way. Now, of course, in terms of designing a course, you will have to find the textbook that works for you. The course syllabus that I will be sharing with you from Dr. Kaneen, it uses one textbook to teach analysis of poetry and another textbook to teach the general analytical skills. I don't know if they're available online, but those are some textbooks that people have used, and those could be useful to you. There are also several handouts that you can use in your classes. Now, coming to the interpretation part, right? The purpose of a literary analysis course is to teach our students how to interpret poetic language, how to interpret language that is stylized, right? That is not everyday speech. So what that presupposes is that since we are interpreting, what that presupposes is that we are also trying to find the meaning of a text. Why is something in a short story and what does it mean, right? Now, meaning at this stage of the course, we can't dwell on, meaning is relative and meaning is discursively produced. What we are just basically trying to teach them is here are a couple of passages. There is figurative language in it. There is use of metaphor. There is, the language is slightly at a higher level of abstraction, and you read it as a reader. And what you're trying to analyze is, what is it saying and why does it matter to know that? So we are staying on the level of the text. Now, someone asked me, kindly explain objective correlative with reference to Hamlet. I don't know why would you need that, because I'm not an expert on Shakespeare, but an objective correlative would be, Shakespeare wasn't a murderer. Shakespeare didn't want to kill his stepfather. Anything that you see Hamlet doing, the main character, you can't relate it to Shakespeare's personal life because what you know is it's a stylized work of fiction. There is a very crude example that T.S. Eliot uses. You can read his essay on it, but that's with reference to what Benjay, one of the characters in Sound and Fury, is imagining, and what he says is, well, that doesn't mean Faulkner likes to do that. But anytime an author has a character who is corrupt, who does terrible things, an objective correlative would be, well, that is not who the author is. This is a work of fiction. So you can extrapolate from a story, but you can't really just say these are the opinions of the author, right? Otherwise, they'll go around reading a novel by Mohsen Hamid and others and saying, well, this is what he believes in, not realizing that he has created a character within a story who believes a certain way. And so that's where the question of objective correlative comes in, not to think that every novel or a short story is a pure reflection of author's consciousness. It could be if you go through psychoanalysis, but author's politics and belief systems, because that's dangerous, but also, not necessarily what we train our students to do. So overall, to kind of sum it up, a literary analysis course or literary analysis and interpretation is usually offered earlier in our students' career, mostly to English majors. And they do also go and then take the literary theory course, which trains them on a higher level of abstraction. The literary analysis course basically teaches them how stylized language, literary language is employed in a given text, what different kinds of genre of literature exist, what is poetry, what kind of poems exist, what is a short story, what is the structure of a traditional short story. I mean, coming to that, I mean, for example, if you were just teaching that, you could use what is the Freytag's model of explaining a short story, that the short story has a beginning point, and there is a rising action, then there is conflict, right? That conflict is resolved, and then there is the falling action where the story is concluded. That's a traditional short story. But if you read your Hemingway, you also know that a short story can just be a slice of life short story, a few hours in the lives of one or two main characters. But you teach them the structure of it. Similarly with the novel. And when you do the analysis, you stay with the text and they read it carefully, and then they practice, they try to interpret the theme, they try to interpret the thoughts and ideas and actions of the main character, what causes it, what kind of causality exists. They try to look at how the plot devices are used to advance the plot, right, and to complicate the plot through flashbacks, through foreshadowing. All of these things on the level of the text without involving any heavy or deep understanding of theory. And so that roughly put, and then there can be assignments, right? There you can develop an assignment where they just read a poem and write a one-page report on it. There can be one mini essay where they pick up one or two things from a short story and interpret it and share with you their understanding of what it means. And then the longer paper towards the end of the semester can be about their understanding and interpretation of a short story. So let's give you an example. Sometimes it pretty obvious things that you figure out, like, the yellow wallpaper. The yellow wallpaper teaches us about what happens to an independent woman when she is confined by the patriarchy. And this is how the story unfolds. This is why this woman is seeing this other woman in the wall, because her life is terrible and she's treated badly. There is no room in a literary analysis course to do a psychoanalytical reading or a deeply feminist reading of the story, because you're staying on the surface of the story and you're interpreting the text as you read it. Now, if you're a textual studies person, and especially if you believe that the text itself can render its own meanings, then of course you can do deeply sophisticated analysis of the text. I mean, traditional scholars used to do that, right? There are people who still do that. A literary analysis course isn't asking for that kind of literary analysis, but it's using the methods that were used by traditional critics. So, like how one short story, how is tension created because of the use of language? Or how is conflict resolved by different characters? How does a character change over the course of a story, and why? This would be a valid reading of a short story. So throughout the analysis, the poem, the short story, the characters in it, its setting would be your main reference. And then you can complicate it with the knowledge of the genre itself. Short story is supposed to do that, this plot does that, or with a little bit of historical knowledge. Now, the example that Dr. Kaneen used in her course is the Ben Jonson poem on the death of his son. Now, you can analyze that poem just technically by looking at the meter, right? And you will find out that right in the middle of the poem where he talks about the loss, the meter breaks down. So if you want to do a deep analysis of the meter itself, you will find out that what he's saying on the surface is supported by the breakdown of the meter. But that will take a lot of analysis skills and a knowledge of how the meter works, how to scan a poem, right? I don't have the skills for that. But that is one form of literary analysis. In the same example that she gives, she also uses some additional knowledge, right? What did Ben Jonson say about the death of his son to someone else? That could be used to interpret the poem somewhat. And, what is inscribed on the grave of his son, here lies his son's name, Ben Jonson's best poetry, something like that. That information can also be sometimes added. But just make sure that encourage your students not to make their essays too autobiographical. They shouldn't always become about the biography of the author. Remember, it took us a long time to escape that trend in literary studies. But overall, then a course that gives them the basic vocabularies of literary analysis, what kind of different poems are there, what is a sonnet, what is figurative language, all the vocabularies, what is alliteration, what is, metaphor, simile, metonymy. These are the vocabularies that you will be teaching in context. And you can develop exercises where they go and look for any metonymic pieces or references within a poem or a short story or any use of metaphor, because we are trying to give them these vocabularies of how language becomes layered because of the use of stylized poetic language. And then in the longer pieces, in the short story, starting with the structure of a short story and then going into different aspects of it, the theme, the setting, the characters, the tone, the point of view, kind of gives them the tools to talk about literature with technical vocabulary and then write about it. And then if you want to do a novel, novel is the most expansive genre of prose writing. So that can be the usage of these terms in interpreting the novels can be more extensive and can help them start thinking about the novel and the art of storytelling in a more sophisticated manner. So overall, by the time they get out of the literary analysis class, your students should know or should have the knowledge of what kind of poems exist, what is the structure of each poem, how to clearly read a poem in a way that you differentiate between the metaphoric part of it, the figurative part of it, and the literal part of it. Coming to the short stories, how to read characters, what kind of characters are there, how to discuss the setting of a short story, how to discuss the plot, how to discuss the ending, how to discuss whose point of view is represented in the story, and then most importantly, how to look at a few passages, read it, and then discuss your understanding of it from the point of view of the text and the context of the story. This is what you're gearing them towards. And then as part of the written assignment, they show you what aspect of it they've understood, which you can have as part of mini assignments, and the final paper, which kind of displays that they have understood at least somewhat the techniques that you have taught them over a semester. Okay, thank you so much for today's session, and I will now see you in our next conversation. Until then, as always, from me to you, peace and love.